Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 75. I have D.L. Cummings, who is host of the Liberty Dad podcast. He's also been working in high tech, and we're going to talk about the woke invasion of high tech and maybe some other liberty issues. How are you doing?
Very well. And I'm excited to see that I'm actually taller than you, at least as it appears on the camera.
Yeah, or we just lowering or raise the chairs. But anyway,
there's that too. So
makes you feel better. That's great. So first of all, how did you become a libertarian?
Oh man, that's a funny story. So at PorkFest recently, I gave my my is this a family friendly show? I mean, I'm not going to get crazy. Wonder how I should feel my
I don't really have any standards, although I will say I'm trying to be worldwide here, but yeah.
Fair enough. So I'll keep it relatively family friendly. So my story is that prostitution was my Ron Paul moment, and it's not what you think. Once upon a time, I was married to my my former wife, my ex-wife. Wait, tongue tied today. My ex-wife. I years ago, I came home. And I've been listening. I was a conservative. We both were conservatives. We were Republican evangelicals. Okay. And I came home from listening to talk radio on the news, and I just out of nowhere, no warning whatsoever, I just said, prostitution should be legal. And she was like, excuse me? And I was like, yeah, it should be legal, blah, blah, blah. And I was just like, kind of like making this argument in favor of it. She got really angry. And I was like, what are you getting so angry for? And I couldn't figure this out. And then I finally realized that she heard I might like to try it. And I was like, whoa, hold on. I was like, that's not where I'm going with that. And so I kind of explained this position of like, like how I now see it. I see it a little differently. Like you have this action, then you add money, and then all of a sudden it becomes illegal. And I was like, but why would the exchange of money make a particular action legal, immoral or legal that was once okay, or at least okay enough, right? And so that didn't really turn me into a libertarian, but it did kind of set the stage, I think. And then as I went along through life, I just kind of kept adopting more and more libertarian principles. And then somewhere around 2017, I was a no party affiliation here in Florida, and I don't know exactly what it was, but I said, you know what, I think I need to be in the Libertarian Party. I think that's where I belong. And so then I started going to the meetings, and I actually officially joined, and then I became a party officer, and then it basically just went, it went downhill. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. Just, it was just an avalanche. You just kept getting more and more involved as time went by. So it was just a progression of things. There was no one moment. Like many people who say I'm a Ron Paul libertarian, where they first heard Ron Paul and they were really, really excited. I didn't have that moment. I just kind of like had one after another over time, and eventually I got there.
Yeah, that's good. So that's an interesting story. So now, what do you do professionally? You do some kind of work involving computers.
Yes. So I automate things for other people. I work for corporate America, and I spend most of my days in Excel spreadsheets, and I make extremely elaborate spreadsheets. These will have like thousands of lines of code. They'll be very, very intense in terms of, producing and putting it together. It's just, there's a lot to it. So it's almost like if you gave, your average Excel user some steroids for their Excel. That's what I do. I create. So something that might take a person 30 minutes, 45 minutes, maybe even longer to do, I will automate that down to just a matter of minutes. So that's what I do professionally.
Yeah, I didn't realize Excel was that robust. It's amazing. I mean,
People create entire applications inside of Excel. I wouldn't say it's a good idea. And I know this because that's what I do. They will literally treat it like a database. We could get into all the technical stuff, but basically it's, it can be very, very elaborate and expansive what people create inside of Excel.
Of course, they could just go get access if they wanted to get a database, but they had to pay more for it. But I guess that's what it is.
Right.
But because all that stuff from Microsoft is designed to be interoperable too. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, you can go from one to the other. I mean, that Gates didn't. Microsoft didn't create any of these things, but they had the brothers. Hey, let's put your word processor, your spreadsheet, and all this stuff into one package.
Right.
And that was a brilliant idea. So, yeah. So you've noticed that people working in tech have gone woke. What have you observed? First of all, I should have asked also how long have you been working and doing technical work?
So I'm 45, and somewhere around, I don't know, maybe 35, 36, or somewhere around there. That's when I started to really start looking at technology. Now, I've always been interested in
Yeah.
technology. Back when I was like 15, I started writing some of my own first programs from magazines. There was a magazine called 321 Contact, and they would always have, like, practically in the middle of the magazine, they'd always have these 2 pages of code. And I was like, oh, what does that do? And so I found where it was supposed to be typed in. I typed it all in, and then just kind of went from there. But I kept it as a hobby for many, many years, and I was not actively involved in tech.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I moved to Charlotte, I actually got involved with the technology community up there. And I actually helped organize and start what was called the Charlotte Hackerspace. And it was just a space where people who were technology enthusiasts and then also makers of any kind could come and collaborate on projects. So you might have people that were making drones this was before you could actually buy them in the store. So these are, everybody, if you had a drone is because you built it yourself. This was back when you had to piece together your own 3D printer. So this was before all that stuff hit the shelves in the stores. And so you would go to one of these kind of places and you would build these kind of things. And so I met a lot of people there, and a lot of them were like, they encouraged me. They said, you really should get involved in technology. And one of my good friends said, why don't you become a web developer and you can learn Ruby on Rails? And I was like, oh, okay. Well, about the same time, I had met my now wife, and we were getting pretty serious. And then her company brought her down to Jacksonville. And by the time that they brought her down to Jacksonville, we had decided that we were going to get married. And so we initially had this like plan to have a long-term relationship, long distance relationship. And then she's like, yeah, I don't really like this long distance relationship. So we changed our plans, and I decided to move down to Jacksonville. And at that same time, that's because I was going to leave my company that I'd been with for like 8 years. And I decided, you know what, how about I take time? And so I took a year off and I studied web development. And then after about a year, I connected with the local Ruby web developer community, and that's how I, through my own personal studies, I eventually, after about a year, said it's time for a job. I went and got a job, started working as a Ruby developer, and that was the official start of my technology career. So,
Yeah.
and then from there, I started seeing all kind of things. We were talking about the woke and whatnot. And so this was, oh man, this is probably in somewhere around the 2014, 2016 time frame, maybe 2013, back it up a little bit, but somewhere around there. That's when I started observing a lot of things, because I started getting on Twitter, and I started, my intention was to just connect with a lot of developers. And that's where I started seeing some of their personal opinions beyond just technology. And then we started seeing things happen either in our community or related communities, because you have different technology communities. You got like your Ruby web development, which is, one programming language. And then you might have your, some other guys that are working in a different language. And sometimes there's crossover and whatnot. But you kind of have these different groups based on the technology of choice. And so I started seeing and hearing all these just wild stories. And I was just like, holy wow. And there was like right now, you might get on Twitter and see all the drama in the libertarian community, or the liberty community, or liberty Twitter, as we like to call it. Right. I've already been through all this with the technology community. Although it was much more work and woke and much more worse. So let's see. Let me give you one story that I remember. There was a guy. He apparently had he was into something called gore, GOR.
Yeah. John Norman. Yeah. The Gore novels.
And so
Science fiction, yeah.
I've never read any of them, so I'm only going on what I read through accounts of the story. But apparently, these novels depict like planets where women are subservient to men or something like that. And so apparently, there's like this group of people that are like super enthusiast, and they 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 act this out in real life. So this guy was a part of that community, and I don't. All I know is that it was relatively consensual because I don't really know much about
Yeah.
the community. I don't know much about the books. I don't really know anything. But apparently, this guy was in this community, it's a private community, and he got exposed. Somebody found out that he was in it, and they exposed him, and they were like, "Look, he's this terrible person. He hates women, blah blah blah." And it created this huge uproar. Basically, people took sides. They were like, either he's a terrible woman hater, or hey, it's just this weird thing that he's into, but it's all consenting. Who cares? And so he ended up getting run out of his own community, right? And again, now this is for behavior that is totally consenting with
Yeah.
full adults, and it doesn't matter whether like you can look at it from my perspective, you can look at it and say, okay, well, it demeans women, but the women that are involved on their from their own will, according to their
So
own in their
he
own
got run out of the tech community.
the particular technology community that he was in.
Yeah. So this was an
So, and I
organization or
think it was like a
association.
Drupal community or something like that, and
Yeah.
that's the name of the technology. And I think he happened to be a relatively significant contributor to that community, and he basically got run out. Like, and when I say run out, I think that just means like run out of leadership. I don't know that he was entirely run out of the whole community per se, but he was in like some sort of leadership position because he contributed a lot of code and project and a lot to projects, and so he basically got run out. And when I read through all this stuff and I was like, okay, um, did he actually do anything that somebody didn't, consent to? Right? Like, was he mean to women? Did he degrade
Yeah.
women, in some way where they weren't participating and saying, hey, I want to be a voluntary participant in this? And to my knowledge, to anything I could find, the answer was no. Right? So that's one story. I think a bigger one that really impacted a lot of different communities was this code of conduct. And um, the code. So what was happening is you had all these like marginalized people, and what the thing that was happening is that people started sticking up for them, but they started doing it in like a more woke way. So it wasn't like somebody was being marginalized and somebody was picking on them and making fun of them, and somebody stood up and said, "Hey, knock it off." That's not what we're talking about. Instead, what they did was they said, "Hey, you can't use certain kind of language. You can't do certain kind of things." Some of it I could agree with, some of it not so much, but all of it was really, from my perspective, a sort of matter of control. So what happened was you started seeing a lot of leaders in the community, and these were typically people that were really good in the development community. They were the ones that were writing blogs, they were producing tutorials. These were the ones that were maybe contributing to the core of many of these technologies. So they were helping build the technologies that many others were using. These were the ones who were getting invited to conventions as speakers. So they were hitting all the speaker circuits. And so what ended up happening is a lot of them started saying, well, if these conventions don't have a code of conduct, I'm not coming. Right. And so they kind of bullied conventions. Now, in a sense, this is a relatively free market. Like, people can do that. Right. Um, but I think this is what happens when you get these personalities, these celebrity types, right? Like, they start wielding a lot of control. And I think it kind of tips the balance of a so-called market in a sense, because everybody ends up just being afraid to push back on them and say, hey, knock that off. This is not acceptable. So what they started doing is they started saying, like, look, if you don't have this code of conduct, they didn't just say like, hey, we want a code of conduct that says, treat people fairly, don't be a jerk, don't say mean things to people, don't use racist terms toward people, just what most people would probably agree with anyway. they were going above and beyond. And like in some code instances, I was reading code of conducts that would try to monitor how people of a particular community or group would behave outside of the group. So it was like, oh, if we find that you're doing something outside, so it'd almost be like if your work says, look, in order to work here, you have to abide by these rules while you're here. Oh, and by the way, if we see that you're like, if you're at the park, if you're anywhere that unrelated to work, and we catch you doing these kind of things, we're gonna address that as well with you, right? And so it became this big push, and most of it really was from my read of these code of conducts. They were really just a bunch of rules, and they were a little bit more on the woke side. They just, like, I hate using that term, but the reality is we all know what it means, and we all kind of have an idea of what it's pointing to when we use it. So, I started seeing things like that. And I'll give you a personal example that I had. So, this will be the last one. We'll throw the ball back to you real quick. So the company I was at I was working as a web developer, and we had this hackathon. And all that is we say, okay, from this time to this time, you get into some groups, and then here's your criteria. You build something, and whoever builds the coolest thing in this time frame with this criteria, they're going to be the winner. So everybody comes up, gets together, they form their little groups however they want, and they pick a name. So me and I think it was like 3 other guys, we were sitting there. We're like, well, what are we gonna what are we gonna pick? And I was like, we noticed that all of us had beards, and we were able to make a play on the company logo and the company tagline with beards. Now, I'm not going to say it because I don't want to inadvertently bring attention to the company. But it was basically using the word beard in playing into the company logo and playing into the company um, statement, or the not logo. I'm drawing a blank at the moment, but the little tagline. And so we put that together. We even created like a little like a little bearded kind of like icon, and we even got some stickers printed out for it. Right? Okay, no big deal. We all had beards. That's how it worked. And so when we went to a convention, our company went to a convention and paid for a number of the employees to go, and we hosted a table at this convention. We were kind of amused, so we brought some of our stickers and put them out there, right? And a young woman walked by, and she said, well, I see that this thing is about beards, and I don't have one, so I guess this place is unwelcoming to me as a person, right? So rather than ask and say, hey, what's this about, or rather than just chuckle and say, oh, that's a fun play on the company name, the logo, and the tagline, rather than just kind of like have a good chuckle at it, it was an immediate jump to something negative. And so it ended up that ended up coming back, and we heard about it at our company. Nothing was really done about it, and in that particular case, like, no harm, no foul. However, when you think about it, you're like, this is the kind of thing that woke, if you will, produces. It produces people that are sensitive to things before they have all the information that they can easily get. Because in this particular case, all that this person had to do is say, hey, what's this about? Oh, we had a hackathon, and several of the guys got together, and they realized that they happened to all have beards. So they made a play on beards because that was something unique to their team. No big deal. Other people, they didn't run with it and make stickers and whatnot, right? Like, that's the only reason they're not here. Otherwise, it was fine. And so, this is the problem that you have in woke. And so this was happening like from my standpoint, 2013, 14, 15, 16, in that time frame. Now, it could have been happening much earlier. I don't really know. So when you see a lot of the more left leaning and wokeness and whatnot coming out of tech now, I'm like, some people are surprised. I'm not, because I've already seen it. I've already seen, and it gets nasty. Like, I've seen some I've observed very foul stories. I've had some friends that have quit jobs over it. They went to a new company, and they're barely a foot in the door, and people are basically sizing them up and playing the woke games and manipulating and doing all these things. And they're like, I'm done. I'm not even going to stay here. And they leave within like a few weeks. Like it's insane. So, all right, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, it's interesting because we've become a victim culture and a grievance culture where the currency is being, playing the victim and
Right.
creating a victim story out of something that may not be that may be completely innocuous.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, yeah, it's definitely happened. I mean, everywhere. And it's interesting too because you remember there was that story where the woman was where some guys were making jokes about dongles
Yep, I
at a
remember that.
conference,
That was out at
and
the Python conference. It was like
yeah,
2015.
and some woman tried to get these guys fired from their jobs, and it's like,
Right.
why? And there's never a
Well, it was worse than that. So hold up.
yeah,
Let's talk about what actually happened because I remember that
yeah.
story. So these two guys, they were sitting next to each other in a conference. It was a Python conference.
Yeah.
And for anybody that's watching that may or may not or
Python
listening,
is a language, and
yep,
of
it's
course
a
it is
programming
actually
language.
yeah, and the person did actually name it as an homage to Monty Python, to their
Right.
credit. Yeah,
So these two guys are sitting there and they're to talk about something on stage, and I think they had some dongles, and like one of the guys made some sort of like sexual innuendo about dongles. I don't remember exactly what the comment that he made was, but he made some sort of comment. The other guy chuckles and laughs, and a young lady sitting in front of them turns around, takes a picture of them. She tweets it out. She tags the conference and a whole bunch of other people. And she was like, this is happening at your conference and making people feel uncomfortable. Now, first of all, there was, like in the moment, the only person that I remember reading about that was uncomfortable or could be considered uncomfortable was the woman. Now, my problem is, I mean, they're all supposed to be adults. And so to me, the easiest way to address this is to turn around and say, dude, knock it off. Right. Like this is how, to me, this is how we handle each other as adults. But instead, she made a big ruckus. She ended up actually getting fired from her position because the position she held at the time was, it was something like and it was like a community engagement director or something like that, but it was something to do with outreach and kind of like bringing
yeah,
the community together. And so her company ended up firing her, and I think one of the guys got fired from his company. I think I don't remember if both of them did. I think one did. Over this dumb comment that it could have been that could have been easily addressed by simple, dude, seriously, come on, grow up. Right? Like simple as that, move on. They'll probably laugh, they might make a joke about you, roll your eyes and move on.
yeah. I know that's the thing here. Too is, I mean, these guys had to be completely blindsided by this. I mean, it was like, and of course, they might not have remembered what they did when it all happened. It's, you know, it, yeah, it reminds me of another story. This was not at a tech conference, but I don't know if you ever heard the story about what they call elevator gate. This was
Tell me
this
some
was
details I might remember.
well, this was in an atheist conference, but
Oh, I don't know any of
a
those ones.
woman goes into an elevator, and a guy just happens to go into the elevator with her, and so they're both in the elevator, and the guy apparently asks her out or something, and she comes back and complains and said, "This guy asked me out, and it was in an elevator."
Right.
Which when you think about it, really isn't a smart thing to do, but it's just like, making these. What do you think? What do you think the motivation is of somebody to do something like this too?
I,
Is
I
it?
I think you nailed it earlier. You said that we're basically creating this victim, this victim
Yeah.
nature, right? And I think what it is people are becoming, like they say, like, oh, I'm woke to injustice. Well, what I think that really ends up being is I'm woke to any slight, and I'm going to treat any slight as if it was the worst. So it's like I joke with my wife, and I'm going to kind of tell on her a little bit here. I joke with my wife, and I say, you treat all your responsibilities equally. In other words, if she has to wash 5 dishes or she has to write a contract for real estate. Like, I'm like, you approach them as if they're all equally important. Like they're and that's why she works so hard, because she's constantly moving from one task to the next, because whatever task that she's working, the priority is whatever needs to be done now. Right. That's the priority. Not so much, okay, that's not such a big deal. So I think this is what's going on in the so-called woke crowd, is where you have people that look at a slight, an injustice, and maybe it is a slight. Maybe somebody does roll their eyes at you for saying something, and that was an unnecessary gesture, right? That's fine. I get it. But that's not necessarily the same as like screaming at somebody and calling them the n-word, right? Like, these are two entirely different interactions, and they should be treated as one is worse than the other. But instead, I think what happens is people are treating them all equally, and the reason I think that they're partially the reason that they're doing it is because some of these things aren't happening to some people, right? Like, if I'm a more left leaning, like into this woke, and I'm seeing injustice, nobody's calling me the N word. So therefore, that's not the one that gets me, but maybe rolling their eyes, maybe a little dismissiveness from somebody, maybe that's what's getting to me, because that's what I'm experiencing. And so therefore, that ends up, for me as the woke person, being treated as something that we generally consider to be extremely offensive. And so I think this is, and so I think that's what we're seeing. And I think people have kind of been trained, in a sense, to actually approach, in these things. That's why we have this, big push on like microaggressions and all this other thing. It's like, well, yeah, maybe there is a such thing as a microaggression, but your response doesn't have to be macro. Your response could just be like, whatever, and just dust your shoulder off and move on. Like, okay, they rolled their eyes at me, whatever, and it's based on context. I mean, if you're trying to tell your boss about something that somebody did, like, hey, this person grabbed me and they shouldn't have been touching me like that, and your boss, dismisses you, yeah, that's a big deal. But if you're trying to, say something that's not really a big deal, and it's not to that level, and you get dismissed pretty quickly, you could probably just roll your eyes and be like, okay, whatever, I'm going to move on from that one. Right? Like, we have to start being more discerning about the things that get our attention and the level of attention that we're willing to give them. But we're not being that discerning, or at least many people aren't. So I think the answer is that they just need to be retrained, and they need to be like told, like, look, some things you brush off, and other things you make us think about. And you really got to learn which one's which.
Sometimes I do wonder what the personality or the psychological impact of people, of the so-called victims who do things like this. Though, is it narcissism? Is it? It seems like to me it seems like to me you got to be really sick to do something like this. I mean, to take pictures of guys at a conference making jokes about dongles or something like that. It just, I mean,
I
I
don't know
don't
that I
think.
would call it sick,
Yeah.
or like even mental. I just think that people have been trained to think that such things really do require escalating to a high degree. And I'm like, we need to retrain them and say, no, it doesn't. Like, I don't know. I mean, maybe you had it happen, but when I came home, it was like, I remember, like, you'd come in and your sister or your brother was picking on you or something like that. And you're like, Mom, so-and-so is doing this. And they're like, and your mom is like, or your dad was like, knock it off. Go back out and play. Right. Like, didn't even want to hear it. Like, hey, quit picking on your brother. Now go play. Right. Like it was pretty simple. Like there wasn't, they didn't make a big issue out of something. Now, maybe sometimes parents should have, but in many cases, when I was growing up, that's what I remember. I remember a lot of people, with similar stories where, they were being picked on by a brother or sister or something like that. Somebody was annoying them. And it was just go back outside and play. Or, hey, like my mom would say this to us. She would say, whatever I do to one, I'm going to do the others. Now, is it that
Yeah.
important? Right. And she made us learn to decide, is this important enough to be addressed, or am I just being whiny?
Yeah, well, and I sometimes it seems to me as though a lot of the people who are, in charge of policing these things. They don't really want to, look into the people who run cons are overwhelmed generally.
Sure.
They don't, if you run a convention or conference, you've got a million things to worry about. And the last thing you want to do is to get pulled into these schoolyard spats. Yeah, there's all this other stuff. And now this silly drama that just happens. And, and I think as a result, they probably do take a half-assed approach to it because they've got so many other things to do. But in some ways it's.
So what happens is you see a lot of the people that are willing to placate to this now. And I'm saying, like, whether they're giving into this victimhood or whether they, they themselves, believe that they're some sort of arbiter to help out victims. They get elevated to power. And I don't want to say that they, it's unjustly that they get elevated, because when I saw a lot of these developers who were getting, who were using this authority, this level of this position of power that they had attained from their hard work, like, they were smart people. They knew what they were doing when it came to technology. And like, they were creating great tutorials. They were doing good work. So the idea that they might become the leader at a con, or that they might become, a team lead in a development shop, a shop with a development team, like that was not unfair. Like most of the ones that I remember seeing did earn that. The problem is, just because you're good at technology doesn't mean that doesn't translate to I'm good at intervening and managing human conflict, right?
Yeah.
That's an entirely different ball game. Because people are not programs that you can just input variables and kind of structure in such a fashion, right? Like, we do things on a whim. I might say one thing and then 2 minutes later do the exact opposite, right? Like we can be unpredictable. And I think that they tend to treat people almost in a robotic sense. Like, we're going to tell you this, we're going to put this rule out, we're going to force this, and then all will be well. And then when it's not, they're like, okay, well, we just need to add more rules. And so it almost ends up being like a mini government in itself.
And Michael Malice was talking about something like this too. And I realize now that it's just the same with these tattletales during what was going on with the coronavirus insanity.
Oh yeah. When people were like, governments were having the apps that you would
that some of these creatures report on these things just because they want to feel important.
Right.
I think that's because in a way I kind of feel sorry for them, because are you seriously that is your life that empty that you look for injustice out of nothing? Or I don't know what kind of psychological disorder goes into this, but I don't think it's healthy. And I think, and as bad as the complainers are, I really do believe the ones who reward them are worse.
Right. So again, we're talking about the site, this, like a psychological profile. Maybe there's some sort of distress. I don't think it's that. I think it's just simply that we've trained people the wrong way. And I think we haven't trained people also to stand up and defend themselves. So let me tell you another story. I'm not going to get into the details because the details would be a little bit too lurid.
Yeah.
But there was supposedly a young lady. Now, this one I was a little hazy on at the time, as like, this really happened, as I was reading through it and I'm looking at the details and I'm like, that really happened? Like, this seems pretty wild. But I'm going to go with it. So apparently, because this, even without some of the more crazy details, the story in itself is probably one that actually has happened many, many, many times. So a young girl was at a conference. She's down in the lobby with the rest of her coworkers, and they're all drinking, right? So far, this describes a lot of companies. And then drinking starts to get out of hand. So people start saying, like, let's do body shots and stuff like that. And she decides that, like, I don't know if I really want to do a body shot. And then they're like, hey, you should do a body shot. And so then she does. And then things progress a little further. People started putting their hands where they didn't belong. And the story goes, much worse than that. But that's as far as we need to go for this particular point that I want to make. I told one of my friends that. Now, my friend that I told, she is shorter than me. I'm 5'3". She's like 4'11" or something like that, maybe 4'10", something like that. And she a feisty one. But I was telling her about this story, and she said, if I was out with my coworkers and I was having a beer, which I sometimes do, and they asked me to take a body shot, I would laugh in their stupid face. That's literally what she said. I would laugh in their stupid face and walk away. And I think this is part of the problem. Like, and I'm not trying to victim blame, like, right, like people touching people that they don't belong touching, that's wrong. Period. End of story. You can short circuit that though by doing exactly that and saying, hey, no, and then walking away. Or if somebody does get a little touchy, slap them upside the head. Like, I'm very much okay with that as well. If I had a daughter, I'd be raising her to say, hey, if a man touches you, ball up your fist, blast him one, right? Like, I'm okay with this. And I don't think that we've taught our young people to really defend themselves in the moment, right? And say, no, that's not acceptable. And if you have to, if it really comes down to it, maybe even make a scene, right? And yeah, you might, there might be a cost for it, right? But eventually what ends up happening is it becomes unacceptable behavior because enough people are doing it that other people aren't willing to try it, right? So and then more importantly, we've created people that are self-confident, confident to say, I will tell somebody no. There is no way in like if I went, I'm 45 now, but even if I was 35 or 25, if I went out and my friends asked me to do a body shot or something that I didn't want to do, the answer was always no. I didn't just give in, not to anything serious that I didn't want to do. I mean, sometimes a little peer pressure, come on, dude, have this extra beer, like whatever. So there is some level of peer pressure that, a lot of people give into, and that's fine. But for seeing things that are very serious to you, the answer should be no, and you should be confident. We should be training our young people to confidently say, absolutely not. And if I have to push you
Yeah.
down, a flight of stairs, I mean, of course, in defense, of course, but I'm kind of being exaggerative on personally, on purpose. Like if I have to get physically dramatic with you, I will. So don't.
Yeah, like just today I got a phone call out of nowhere from an organization that I've given money to, and I've gotten mailings from them, but they've never called me. And then just and about a few minutes into the call, I just said, I'd really like that you not call me, thank you. And
Right.
I do like what you do, and I appreciate what you do, but I don't want you calling me. And so we hung up. But it was just and a lot of times that works. I remember just recently I attended Freedom Fest,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a former chair of the LNC that I don't like, and I know that he does not like me. I didn't say a word to him. He didn't say a word to me.
Right.
It's amazing how easy it is.
Right.
And sometimes you may have a case where somebody, and you do have to say, I don't, sometimes, maybe somebody doesn't know if you do want, if you don't want to interact with them, or,
Right.
it's not hard to do that, but people don't do this. And, what's interesting too is the person who screams and yells isn't really the person you got to worry about. It's the person who's just so quiet. They're going to be the one who go and say, "Oh, I better complain about this," and they make histrionics about it. They try to
Right.
damage somebody's reputation. It's
And,
and
and don't get me wrong, there is a time and a place to seek out authority and say, hey, look,
yeah,
my coworker is doing
mhm,
this. I've asked them to stop. They're not, I've done that myself. I think it has an appropriate place. I just think that what we've done is we've
yeah,
expanded the 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 issue for
yeah,
which we are willing to do that, and we've kind of elevated minor things that we could probably just ignore or just say knock it off, and we've made
yeah,
those as equal to things that are much more egregious.
yeah. And I think the worst thing is this really, when you do this, you're now going to get to a point where people don't want to listen at all, and they
Oh
just
yeah.
it's like, you know, I don't want to hear you complain, because that's all you do. If you keep crying wolf, and you know it, it's like, it's like it'd be like calling 911 because somebody stole $5 from you. I mean,
Right.
you don't,
Well,
you don't,
I knew a
you
young
might
lady
call the
years.
police. You might call the police because somebody stole $5 from you, but you're not going to, 911 is for emergencies. It's not.
Right. Well, it's like a young lady that I knew many years ago, and she just kind of was a bit hot tempered, and she would get mad at in our group of friends about things, kind of quickly. And she kind of had this reputation, like, oh, so and so's mad again, right?
Yeah.
And not all the things that she was mad about did she need to be mad about, right? Like, some things, sure, that's a legitimate anger to be, and then other things, it was like, come on, really, you're gonna spend your time being angry about that? You could ignore that and move on, and it's the same thing. Like, people are gonna get fatigue over all these microaggressions and whatnot, and because they're gonna have that fatigue, and because, in my opinion, we're elevating all these things about as equally, what's going to end up happening is that some serious things are going to go kind of, people are going to disregard them. It's almost going to be like the boy who cried wolf, right? Where the town people eventually were like, yeah, he's just making that up. But that time he really needed some help. Well, I think it's going to be the same thing. We're going to start seeing people are just going to get done with it, and it's going to be relatively abruptly, and they're just going to be like, you know what? Don't care. And it'll be at a time when they really do need to care, when that person really does need assistance. And that's going to be unfortunate, because I think that when people need assistance from somebody else, it should be there should be, we should have it created in our society that people are willing to listen and then offer that assistance.
Oh yes, exactly. Do you
Did you
think
hear?
this?
I'm sorry to interrupt. Did you hear the story about a woman who was driving down the road? I don't remember what state or city this was in, but she was driving down the road and she saw a toddler on alongside like the highway or something like that.
Oh
So
wow.
she stopped. She's like, "Why is this toddler like on a
Yeah.
busy road?" I can't remember if it was a state highway or an interstate highway or whatever. And so she stopped and she's on the phone with like a friend or somebody like that, and then she's talking about this toddler, and then all of a sudden she screams, and then like the woman disappeared for like a day or two or something like that. Like nobody knew where she was. They couldn't find the toddler. They were like, what in the world happened? So on Twitter, I saw people, they were like, oh my God, we can't even stop if we see a toddler now. See, that's exactly what happens. Like, people start becoming skeptical, like, like, maybe
Yeah.
I shouldn't stop for this toddler because maybe it's a setup. And I don't want, like, I want to help a toddler, but I don't want to be set up because I don't want nothing to happen to me. Right. And
Yeah.
this is the world that we're creating, where people don't want to help their neighbors, and everybody waits for
Yeah.
somebody else to, like, if I'm the woke person, if you will,
Yeah.
I have to wait for an authority figure to intervene, because I've made all my
Yeah.
peers, those around me, too afraid to intervene, because, who knows what'll happen. It's kind of like a decade or two ago when you heard stories about people that would help somebody and then get sued. They would do the Heimlich maneuver and break a rib, and they would get sued for breaking their rib. And so then we had to start passing
Yeah.
laws, these Good Samaritan laws that said, okay, if you're if you're doing something and you're trying to help out, you can't be punished. Like, it's ridiculous
Yeah.
that we even needed a Good Samaritan law, for somebody
Yeah.
that was legitimately trying to help, even if they didn't know what they were doing.
Well. Do you know how they got Ross Ulbricht?
No, I'm a little hazy on the details at the moment.
Well, he
I mean,
was.
I kind of get the gist of it, but I don't.
Well,
Go ahead.
well, he was in the library on his computer,
Mm-hmm.
and apparently the female FBI agent and the male FBI agent, they started to have having an argument.
Mm-hmm.
And that was when Ross decided to get up from his laptop and try to intervene to protect her.
Okay.
She immediately flash drive went into the laptop and started, and that was how they got Russ Ulbricht.
Oh, interesting.
And if he just not helped at all, or just stayed there on his laptop minding his own business,
Wow.
who knows?
Yeah, I was not aware of those details.
That was how they got Russ Ulbricht.
And this is like, I understand. I mean, I'm not agreeing with it necessarily. I understand when like authority, like police, use these kind of tactics, right? Doesn't mean I agree with it, but I kind of get it. You're trying to lure, somebody out or whatever. You gotta think about, this shouldn't be standard practice with
Yeah.
people in general, right? And I feel like it
Mhm.
kind of is. I feel like people do kind of try to pull these similar kind of stunts, like, oh, let me say this. Like I got stories for days, so bear with me. I remember a guy, and I swear to God, all these stories are true, 100%. Um, I knew a guy when I was like in my 20s. He was a flooring guy, and
Yeah.
he had his own business. And I think he mostly did carpet. This was up in Indiana when I lived up there. And he told me something. He said, sometimes when I have like a new recruit that I'm working with, I'll put a $5 bill, like I'll put it down in the somewhere in the house, like maybe in the closet or something like that. And then I'll see if this new employee gives it to me or if they pocket it. And that's it. And I was like, dude, you're setting them up. Like I get it. Like that's, so I guess, a way to test them. But I just felt like that was morally wrong. Like
Yeah.
you're trying to tempt somebody. You're trying to, you know, like rather than wait and say, look, somebody had dropped some money here and it turns out that you weren't so honest and I had hoped you were. It's almost like you were trying to push them into being dishonest by dangling it over them, you know. And if you're a new person, you might be more in need of money, right? So that your willingness to pocket it
Yeah.
might be increased at the beginning of your employment, whereas once you get settled in, you've got recurring checks, maybe not so much. So I
Yeah.
just don't see the point of trying to make somebody fail like that, right? And so these kind of things, just like, these are the things that I think that we need to roll back. We need to tell people, like, look, knock it off, right? Like when somebody does something wrong, like it's okay to tell them, knock it off. It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter how big they are. We need to be confident, and we need to be confident that our peers will back us up. But we also need to make sure that we're not doing it over every little thing, because people are just going to get tired of it. So
Yeah. Or you just end up creating a low trust society. Sometimes, yeah, my favorite thing about employees is the employer who will, and I've heard of employers doing this. They'll take their employee out to lunch,
mhm,
and they will tell the restaurant to intentionally screw up their order to they because they want to see how the candidate reacts.
right.
And I can, but considering how much of a crapshoot hiring people can be, I can understand why they do that. I have to admit, if I ever have my own company and I'm hiring people, I want to see how that person behaves around dogs.
Fair enough. I
Uh,
don't
and
mind
not
a
not
little.
because they're going to have to interact with dogs, but I think when you see a person interacting with dogs, you see who they really are.
I mean, don't get me wrong. At the end of the day, anybody that
Yeah,
runs a business is free to make these kind of decisions, right? Like I would not lift a finger to try to stop them,
yeah,
not in terms of like some sort of legal, imposition or whatnot. But that doesn't mean that I always like them, right? And so, but I mean, I
yeah,
understand it, and I just think that I think that when it comes to like hiring, when it comes to engaging with people, I think there are better ways of, one, finding out who somebody is without kind of luring them into trouble. And I think that there are better ways of addressing people or addressing situations where people are being inappropriate. And then there are those few cases where, yep, it does require reaching out to the manager or the supervisor or whomever, right? Like sometimes, yep, you do got to go and kind of be the snitch, like, and so I totally get that. But I think that I think we shouldn't want it. Like you mentioned COVID a moment ago. Like cities were like, oh, we got this new app. If you see somebody like not wearing a mask, if you see somebody,
yeah,
in a space that they're not supposed to, you take a picture and you send it to us. And there was an account that I saw years, not want to say years ago, but like, maybe months ago or something like that. And it seemed like this guy would go around and take pictures. He was in a major city like New York or something like that. And he would take pictures of cars that were illegally parked, and then he would report them. And like, I'm not talking about like, hey, I was trying to get here and park, and this person who was illegally parked and made it difficult for me. And so then, then I had to
yeah,
go through more effort. Right now, we're not talking about that. Like they just literally would be walking around looking for people and they weren't even being paid. Like they
yeah,
were not an employee of the city. They were just literally somebody that's like, I don't like rich people, so I'm gonna get them. I'm gonna stick it to them.
yeah.
And I'm like, we should be frowning on this and saying, look, I get it. This person, maybe they're a little on the arrogant side, but you have an issue too.
Yeah. I think I have called on people who parked by fire hydrants.
I mean, again, nothing that I'm saying
Yes.
precludes all situations. What I'm
Yeah.
trying to do is what I'm really trying to say is like we should be more discerning on when is it
Yeah.
appropriate? When do we need to do that, right? And not always. I had a friend, like, a lot of cities, they'll have the like an ordinance that say you can't park on the sidewalk. Like even if you're like hanging over onto the sidewalk from a driveway, right? Like some of them will say like you can't even be on a sidewalk then. And I remember a friend of mine, his neighbor, and they lived like kind of like as you were getting on the outskirts of a small town. Like the town was like, I don't know, 3,000 people. I mean, it was a tiny little town. And she would call the police when his car was over over the sidewalk, even though she never came outside. Nobody ever was walking. It's not like people were obstructed. Nobody would be walking. It wasn't causing a problem. Yes, it was, a violation of the city ordinance, but nobody, like, to me, if you're going to reach out to authority and say, you might need to take a look at this person and do something about it, it should be either in a very serious situation where like, hey, we need to, you need to not be doing this because it could cause harm. And by the time it does, it's too late to rectify it. Or, hey, it's obstructing me and causing me a significant problem. Right. But otherwise, just to do it just because you happen to see it, I think people need to move on. They need to stop. And we're getting worse because we're doing it in our
Yeah.
personal interactions now. It used to be the little old lady who would do it when you parked over the driveway. Now it's your peer who's doing it because maybe they thought that you rolled your eyes at them, and and maybe you did, but maybe you didn't. Or did you hear the story about the Amazon driver and the guy who got locked out of his smart home?
I didn't hear about this
That
one.
was like 2 weeks ago.
Mhm.
I don't know. I'm drawing a blank on when you could look it up, but a guy he had a smart home, and I don't know to the extent of what that means, but an Amazon driver came out, dropped a package off, and I think there was like an automated message or something like that from the doorbell, from the like the Ring doorbell or whatever it was, and the Amazon driver thought that the person that lived there used I think it was a racial slur, so they
Oh,
reported
geez.
it. So they reported it, right? And then they and then what happened was this guy comes home and finds out that he's locked out of his house and locked out of his Amazon account. So he like calls Amazon and he's like, "What is going on?" They review it and they're like, "Well, it looks like you were reported for uh for insulting one of our drivers." And he's like, "But I wasn't even home and I wasn't on the mic." And so then they went further and they reviewed the footage, and then they determined that the driver misheard. Right. Well, this guy was locked out of his house for like, or not, I don't know if it's his house, but it was locked out of a lot of his accounts for like a week. Right. Like this is
I,
insane, you know? And
yeah, I am truly amazed that anybody would do this. I mean, these Alexa devices, to me, that is absolutely, positively nuts.
I mean, I have one, so I can't really
Yeah,
say a lot.
I mean, those people have. I mean, that's crazy. You're allowing all of your you would the potential, and this is exactly why.
Right.
I hope that the people are, there are people that I respect that have Alexa in their house, and I'm like, no
Right.
way, not in a million years will I ever do that.
Right. No, I
Like you
totally
said
get it.
about the smart home, I mean, it's they're going to try to do it with cars, and I'm afraid they are. It's
I
but
mean,
yeah,
I think it is going there. Right. And so I think
yeah,
the better answer, like on one hand, yeah, sure, it's probably good that a lot of people delay and say, look, you know what, maybe it's not such a wise idea to outfit our whole entire house with technology that we don't have full 100% control over, right? But on the other hand, I think we really need as a society to start getting back to this notion of, hey, a lot of problems you can probably deal with on your own. You don't need somebody else. And many of these problems, they're really not problems at all. They're just dumb things that people do. And a simple knock it off, walk away, is probably sufficient for many of them. Right now, if it gets escalated, then sure, that's a different story. If it already is escalated, like if it's, if we're talking like somebody just kind of like, you're talking and I'm like,
Yeah.
like you could just roll your eyes at that. But if you're talking and then I just start using racial slurs at you, well, yeah, that's a problem. And yes, it should be addressed, maybe even by somebody in authority over the both of us. So it's not that I oppose this idea. It's just that we need to be more discerning. And currently, that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you've heard of what they call the victim triangle, but it's basically it's the victim, the rescuer, and the perpetrator. And
I've not heard of this.
and everybody looks at things this way. There's a victim, there's the perpetrator, and then there's the rescuer, and the rescuer is always intervening. And I think I do think that a lot of people want to act as the rescuer just so they can feel important. And in some cases, they're the ones who really want to make mountains out of molehills. So
Right. Well,
I mean,
I agree in a sense. I do agree. Are you familiar with the quote by C.S. Lewis about the word, like it's like the
tyranny for your own good.
it's basically the tyranny for your own good. It's like, hey, the robber baron will at least
Yeah,
sleep at some point because they'll be satiated, but the person who does it for your own good
yeah,
never will, because they're like, oh, this is for your own benefit, so I gotta help you. I gotta keep helping you because, yep, I just see another thing that you need help. I see another thing, and I think that you're right on kind of like this. You call it the victim, the perpetrator, and the
the rescuer.
rescuer. So I think the rescuer does kind of fall into that in many cases where people are looking and they're like, I got to protect people. I got to help people out. Right. But most people really don't need helping out most of the time. Most of the time, they just probably need to just shrug it off. And then sometimes they need to stand up to somebody. And then sometimes maybe they need a friend to stand up with them. And then occasionally, yeah, they probably do need some authority or somebody to come in and intervene on a more serious level. But the rescuers, they seem to kind of thrive on this, like, I'm a do-gooder. And I don't think that there is no end to it, that you're a victim and they can keep finding a way. It was once upon a time, it was, mean words, like really mean, foul words, and bullying and picking. And now we're like, well, there's microaggressions and there's, you didn't pick this person, and all these other, things that are, it's not even so clear that there's actually a transgression there.
Yeah,
So, and I think that's what's going on is, you've got people that have kind of got into that mode, and they keep, as we might say, they keep perpetuating the victimhood.
I think there's also probably the most ridiculous thing was being given a lecture on a board because I used female and male as nouns.
Mm-hmm.
That is according to these nuts, that's considered offensive.
But
And
they
of
are
course,
nouns.
yeah. No, these people insisted that they should only be used as adjectives. So a female person or a male person, yeah, and that it's offensive to use them as nouns. It was the most.
Oh, are they? Is that kind of like the context of like, hey man, let's go out and pick up some females, right? Like kind of like this jock talk.
It's hard to say. I was using the word female to refer to females of all ages because you realize that there really isn't. It's the only noun that will refer to all ages. I mean,
Right.
because if you call a 30-year-old female a girl, that's considered offensive too.
Right.
But female is the one word that can be used from age 0 to age 100, and it still applies.
I mean, so I like, if it had been my conference, I wouldn't have felt the need to pull anybody aside and say, hey, look, let's have a
Yeah,
talk. You should
this
only
was a
use this,
board, not a conference, but
or I'm
yes,
sorry, a board.
yeah,
I can understand where people, it might make them feel a little awkward because if you're talking about real tangible people, we usually say words like women or girls or
yeah,
ladies or people, which is a little bit more like, it's those words I feel like are a little bit closer to the humanness, right? The human connection, whereas female tends to be a more like academic term as opposed to one that you might expect to hear out in the wild, if you will. But again, I don't think it was. Like to me, I would just be like, it'd be like if somebody pronounced a word in an awkward way. Like there's some guy out there, I don't remember who he is. He pronounces human like human or something like that. And like when you listen to him say it, it just like it
Yes.
really stands out, and you're like,
Yeah.
it's really weird. Like, but I don't get offended by it. I'm just like, okay, he says it weird. So
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I know there's lots of people say things a funny way that just happens that way. I don't know. I don't know where we go from here, but I think we're getting to a point where there's a large group of people who are just, as a result, they're rebelling against this, and they're just throwing all courtesy out the window.
oh yeah.
Saying, and this has been a while, but I don't know if you remember that incident a while ago, the Costa Concordia that was in Italy when the captain of the ship basically tried to wreck. I think he purposely tried to wreck the ship. That
No,
was in
I'm
Italy.
drawing a blank on that one.
Well, I think it was the Costa Concordia. But one of the most interesting things that happened with that was, yeah, the Costa Concordia. The captain. This was in. Oh, this was in 2012.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
That's a while back for
yeah, it
sure.
was 2012. But one thing that happened, he tried to wreck the ship. I mean, you could theoretically charge him with thousands of counts of attempted murder if you wanted to. I mean, when you're trying to wreck a ship like that. But
Right.
one thing that they said that was interesting is that women and children first was completely thrown out. The men
Right.
just said the heck with this. They pushed the women out of the way and just ran for the lifeboats.
Right.
And I think that's a big result of this. And I think nowadays too, that probably would happen if something like that happened. It was, yeah,
It's hard to say, but yeah, we're in a disarray, and we really need to regroup and set people straight and say, look, you have a lot more power over your life,
yeah,
and you don't need other people to intervene. And more than likely, you're not a victim.
yeah,
You might have a few interactions that are unpleasant that need to be addressed, but overall, you're not a victim, and you don't have to act like one, and you don't have to wait upon, basically a knight in shining armor to show up and save you from all these evil doers. Like you have
yeah,
power. There are things that you can do. But if there comes a time where it's a little much for you to handle, reasonably a little much, then yeah, we got your back. Like these are the kind of messages that we need to send, and then say, like, look, you want to try to figure it out yourself in many cases. Now, there are some cases where, like, if if there's a if there's a stalker on a college campus and young ladies are, feeling a little uh unnerved, I mean, that makes sense. Like I would if I was a young woman. I might even if I was not a young woman, I might even if I was me, depending on the nature of what we're looking at, right? But um, that goes back to the discernment part, where we have to learn be discerning. Like, okay, stalker on campus, 2 or 3 people have already been killed. Yeah, I want to be on high alert. Like that's a big deal. Somebody being a little bit dismissive to me in a conversation, maybe they're not even over, any power. There's no power dynamic over me. I don't need to worry about that. Like sometimes people are rude. Sometimes people don't realize, the actions that they're taking, and they actually don't mean it. And sometimes, I mean, I found where sometimes you'll tell people like, "Hey, that was kind of rude," and they're like, "What are you talking about?" And then you tell them, and they're like, and they're like floored. They're like, "Oh my god, I didn't realize I was doing that. And they feel really, really bad. And I'm like, I didn't need anybody. All I had to do was just tell you myself, like, hey, that was kind of rude, and then explain why. And then sometimes people get it, and sometimes people don't. But I think the majority of the actions that we encounter from other people can be addressed on our own confidently, and that's what we need to be teaching people. That's what I'll be teaching my son, by the way. And I'm Liberty Dad, and I'm gonna be telling
yeah,
him, like, look, you go out in the world and you face it head on and grab the bull by the horns and don't be afraid. And you stand up to people, and sometimes maybe even stand up to people on behalf of others, because sometimes that's necessary.
yeah, and I think you just have to. And sometimes I say, if you're not comfortable, if you don't want to speak it, there or a way that you can write it down. Sometimes I would just write something down and then hand it to the person because I just didn't feel like I could say it, but it seemed
Right.
easier to do it that way.
Sure.
I don't know, and and it seems like we would have a more honest society. And I think some people are afraid they're going to go too far if they start getting critical. Because one example I like to use is the restaurant manager walks around the restaurant,
Right.
and he says to the customer, says, "How was everything?" The customer says, "Fine."
Right.
And then the manager says, "Is there anything I can do for you?" It says, "No." And then the customer walks out of the restaurant, gets on the cell phone, calls up a buddy, and says, "That place was terrible."
Right.
And it's like, the manager opened a door and said, gave the customer an opportunity to express dissatisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
And they could have maybe the manager could have given a discount. Maybe the manager could have comped something. They could have given them something and maybe made the customer feel better. But instead, both people walk out really, and it ends up creating a lose-lose.
Right. And I think it's because people don't assert themselves when they
Yeah.
need to be, or just ignore it. So, for example,
Yeah.
same situation, right? Like I go to a restaurant, I'm unhappy. I have a personal rule. I will either tip accordingly. So I always tip 15% minimum. That's my thing. If somebody is, pretty decent, I'm going to tip them 20% or more, depending on, like the level of service. Like there's been some service where I'm like, wow, this was pretty wild and awesome. And so they get like a huge tip from me. Right. But I have a rule. If I'm not willing to call a manager over or even tell the employee myself, the server, that I was displeased with the service that I got, then I'm tipping 15%. And then my other rule is that when I walk out, if I tip 15%, I'm not going to make a big stink of it, because there was no reason. If it wasn't a big enough deal to make a stink in the moment, because I get it. Maybe maybe some people want it confrontational and they don't want to call up, the server and be like, "Hey, you did a terrible job, and that's why I'm giving you, $1. If you had done better, blah, blah, blah." And I actually wouldn't recommend that anyway. But if you're not even willing to call the manager over and say, "Hey, you know what? I like this place and I don't think your server's a bad server, but I think they were dropping the ball today," whatever, however you might say that. If you're not willing to do that, then you should just let it go completely. You walk out of the restaurant, you're done. You had your opportunity to say something, you chose not to. So now you move on.
Yeah.
But we don't live in that society right now.
How do you think we get back to a healthy society? Because I don't know how we get out of this.
We have kids and we raise them right. We raise them to be assertive and to be respectable. Well, I raise my kid and say, "Look, son, when you go to a restaurant, if it's a big enough deal, call the friggin' manager over. If you're not willing to call the manager over, then maybe it's not such a big deal to you. And if it's not such a big deal to you, when you leave, remember, it's not a big deal to you. So therefore, you let it go. Hey, son, somebody rolls their eyes at you, move on. If it's your boss and you're trying to tell them something really important, and maybe they're being extremely dismissive, then maybe you do escalate it. Maybe hopefully you say, "Hey, look, we need to have a conversation because this is not acceptable behavior." If you're not comfortable doing that, then maybe you do reach out to their supervisor, or maybe you reach out to a peer that can, assist you. But you first and foremost try to resolve every interaction that's unpleasant to you. You try to resolve it first and foremost with yourself. And the first part of that is, do I even need to bother? Maybe I don't. Maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe I can just move on, and who cares? Because the amount of effort that I'm going to put into this to get some potential result later, one, is probably not going to work. And number two, just too much energy for too little gain, if any. I think that's the way that we do it. And then we, as far as adults, we just insist that other adults act the same. We're like, "Hey, look, knock it off. Go figure it out yourself. Quit whining about this. Like, seriously, like somebody said something a little mean to you, then go talk to them and say, 'Hey, why did you talk to me like that?'" And just, kind of push back and encourage our peers to behave in that manner, and maybe you do cut somebody off. Maybe you say, "Look, this person's, no good. I'm done talking to them," whatever. But there are things that you can do personally, and that's where we should start. We should always start personally with me. What can I do? And the first thing that I try to do is can I ignore it? Can I just move on? Maybe I can. And we don't always get it right. That's okay. But that's our first way of getting back to it. And just by pushing other people and say, hey, look, this is how it works. This is why you wonder why I'm not so stressed about life, because I'm not worried about every little interaction that I'm having with somebody. I'm worried about the big ones, the ones I can't solve. The ones I can solve, I do. And the ones that don't matter, then I move on and I think about something else. Because why should I allow something dumb to reside into my brain and stress me out if it shouldn't even matter, right? And I think that's the way. I think that's how we get back to it, just by raising the kids right and
Yeah,
their peers.
I'm not so optimistic, but
Well, I didn't say I
because
was optimistic. You
because
just
I
asked
think
how.
also, just as on an individual level, how you deal with it, it seems to
Right.
be, and I think also because it's creating a system of profits for people. Yeah. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your Liberty Dad podcast. I mean, what you're doing with that?
So I'm kind of, it's almost like I'm in between episodes, like in between jobs, kind of a thing. I haven't been producing as many episodes as I would like, and I've kind of come across like this almost like writer's block, and I'm having some challenges. But the idea behind the show is, before my son was born, I was like, man, I was like, what am I? I wanted to do a podcast. I'm like, what am I going to do? And then I was like, also, I have this son that's being born, like, and I started realizing, like, hey, I ought to be a dad, and in the same vein of what we were talking about, somewhat, I'm going to be teaching him a lot about the world as he's growing up, you know? And I was like, well, what do I want that to look like? And I said, but, and what happens when one day he comes home, maybe from college or from school or whatever, and he's got some different idea about the world than I taught him? And I was like, well, what would I want that to look like? And what I want is, I want my son to always feel comfortable to come to me if he wants and say, hey, dad, I know that you raised me to think that capitalism was the best, the best idea to maintain, like, property and, stuff like that. But you know what, dad, I heard about this communism thing and it sounds pretty appealing. What do you think? Right. And it's not that I want my son to always think that I have all the right answers. What I want is him to respect me to the point where um, he's interested in my answers, right? He's curious. He's like, what would dad say? I'm curious. Even if he doesn't listen, it's fine.
Yeah.
And so I came up with this notion of, the way that you talk today sets the stage for your conversation tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right. And so my show isn't really like Liberty Dad, come on here, listen, I'm gonna tell you all these dad tips. It's not quite what it does. The idea is to, like, say, here's how I think we should engage other people. Here's the way that I should, I don't always live up to my own standards, and I get that. But the goal is that I keep trying to any interaction that I have with people, to make it such that later, if they come across me or somebody else comes across them, I'm sorry. Yeah. So if you meet me today and then next week our paths cross, then what I want is, I want you to be like, oh, I remember DL. He was a good fellow, and it was a great conversation. Right. Even if you disagree with everything I say, it's fine. But I also want, if you talk with me today and then you run across another libertarian, somebody else, next week, I don't want your interaction with them to be soured by my interaction, which happens all the time. Right. So that's the gist of this, is to say, like, let's prepare for tomorrow's conversation by how we engage today, which is literally my tagline. And so that's the idea behind it. What I do now, what does that actually look like? What the episodes look like? So right now I do a dad talk series. That is where I bring on dads, just everyday dads, like nobody particularly special. Like, I'm not trying to reach out to like Jordan Peterson or anybody like that, just regular everyday dads. And I want to talk about what they want to talk about. So like, if a dad wants to get on the show and like, hey man, let me tell you about, my automotive hobby and how that plays a role in me being a dad. That's awesome. That sounds like a great conversation. So we have that conversation. Another thing I do this show called Friendly Fire, which is kind of like underneath this umbrella of Liberty Dad. And the Friendly Fire show is there for me to interview candidates, public candidates, and sometimes party candidates, and be a little tough on them. Although I think I've seen a few other podcasts that are a little tougher than me, so I might have to step up my game. But be a little tough because I want to raise the bar. I want candidates who are running for the Libertarian Party to feel challenged when they're being interviewed by their fellow peers who are running podcasts. I don't want it to be like, oh man, that's awesome, you're so great, blah blah. Like, no, but I don't want it to be hostile either. I just want it to be like, hey, look, I know you're trying to go out and represent us. So I want to push back a little bit to the point where I feel confident that you're going to represent us, because people outside of the party are going to push back a whole lot harder than I will. And I'll also like review bills on the show. So I'll like read a bill if it's short or something like that. And I'll just give my opinion. I'm not a lawyer. It's just a simple opinion from reading it and kind of like, what do I think of the bill? So that's basically the gist of it. And it's just to hopefully push people to be better engaged with their fellow man, people, however we want to say it. And then also to be more inquisitive about the world around them and say, you know what? I am curious what this bill says. I'm going to go read it myself. So that's the
Yeah,
gist.
there's lots of things you can do. Certainly, yeah. Speaking, one thing I've asked everybody regarding the Libertarian Party is, what do the haters of the Mises Caucus really want?
I don't know, because I'm not one and I don't have a
Yeah.
great relationship with them. I think for some of them that maybe hater is a strong word.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
and what I mean by that is I think there are some people, I'm not going to try to name any names, but I think there are some people who are dissatisfied with the Mises Caucus. And I think that part of their issue is they've just had some bad experiences and they're letting that kind of dictate it. And they're not reaching and saying, look, let's sit down, have a cup of coffee, and let's talk this out. Let's see if we can't find some common ground somewhere to walk away with where we can work together. Because the fact of the matter is, if you're in the party, you're in the party, and you got to work with who's there. Um,
Yes.
there are others where, there are some who I think they're not interested. I think I've met quite a few people who are like, well, I'm doing all this stuff in the party. And I'm like, and they're like, but I got to get out because the Mises Caucus. And I'm like, okay, well, what are you doing? I'm like,
Yeah.
excuse me. I said, what are you doing? Like, and they're not doing anything. And they're like, well, I ran for office one time. And I'm like, nobody knows that, right? Because you were busy complaining, not running for office. The
Yeah.
candidates that we had here in Jackson, we had 3 candidates running for office. You almost never saw them arguing with libertarians online. Almost
Yeah.
ever, right? And 2 of them, I don't think you ever saw them arguing. One, occasionally he would kind of get into it a little bit, but they were busy running for office. And if you sat them down and you said, what was it like running for, what did you do? Man, they're like, how long you got? Because I could tell you stories for hours about my campaign. Whereas other people I've met, they're like, well, I ran for office. I'm like, okay, well, what about that? And they're like, well, I didn't get any party support. I'm like, okay, but like, did you talk to people? Like, did you go to events? Like, I mean, like, did you do anything that you had power to do? And the answer, unfortunately, in many cases is no. And it's not always with people that are running for office per se. Sometimes it's just people that are like, I'm in the Libertarian Party and, like, now I'm changing my affiliation because I just can't be. Okay, well, what is it that you can do? What is it you can't do now? While you're affiliated with the Libertarian Party that you can do with other affiliations. And I don't usually get an answer when I ask that. So I think some people, I think it's a mixed bag. I think you've got some who just hate them and it's end of story and they don't really care.
Yeah.
Others who are kind of like, I've had some bad experiences, and then I think others just might maybe have a different view. This is that simple.
It's one of those things too that sometimes I think a negative experience may cloud everything else. I mean, getting back to what we were talking earlier, let's imagine, there's a dance and a teen dance, and the boys and the girls are going out to the dance.
Right.
The boy goes up, and the boy maybe goes up to 10 girls, asks 10 of them to dance. Maybe 5 of them say yes. He might even get repeats with a few of the 5 that say yes.
Right.
4 of them say no. But then
Right.
there's the 10th girl who goes up and says, "Hey, I want that boy asked me to dance. Try to throw him out of here."
Right.
There's a good chance that boy is probably not going to go back to that dance.
Right.
Just because of that one. And I wonder, if it's if you have one person who one really melodramatic jerk off, and it just and it just clouds everything else, or it's or imagine you're a football team and you win 9 games by an average of a touchdown. So,
Right.
but then you lose your 10th game by 100 points. So your total score still ends up being negative. It's
Right.
I mean that's
So
because I
part
because
of
I
that
do
is
think
social
I
media.
do think sometimes somebody has one really negative interaction and it ends up completely outweighing interactions that might have been somewhat positive.
Right. So I don't, I'm sure there's a term for it and I don't know what it is,
Yeah.
but there's this idea, and I think it's related specifically to social media, where um, it becomes certain things become uh, they feel like they're bigger than they really are. And what I mean by that, like take libs of TikTok, right? Like we all see libs of TikTok, and like every day, 2 or 3 times a day, they've got some crazy person on there doing something, right? And so then we're all like, we see all these videos, and we see maybe in the span of 1 week, we might see like 10 videos, right? It's not really a lot of videos comparatively to the internet. But when you're looking at 10 videos of people basically doing the same thing that we disagree with, well, that's a lot more videos than we would have normally experienced, say, 15 years ago, right? So it's almost like there's more access to negative stuff, which gives us the perception that this negative stuff is bigger than it really is. And I think this goes for anything. It's not just the Mises Caucus. It's libs of TikTok. You're watching the videos, and it makes you feel like every single kindergarten teacher out there is loony. When in reality, like, yeah, you saw 10 videos, but how many schools are there in the United States,
Oh
right?
yeah.
And like when you start breaking it down like that, you start realizing like, well, maybe it's actually a really, really tiny percentage, because most of the time you could watch 10 videos, and then if I say, or even 20, and I could ask you, I say, wow, you saw 20 videos of crazy lunatic teachers, right? Whatever they're doing, doesn't matter. And then I say, do you know any in real life? Well, no, but I saw these 20 videos. So, like, these 20 videos felt more real than what you've actually personally experienced. And I think this is the nature of social media, right? Like, we see things and it feels like a bigger threat, a bigger issue than it really is. And I think this can play a role in how people see the music, because I spoke to plenty of people. I'm like, they're like, well, the Mises Caucus is terrible. And I'm like, how many of you talked to in person? And I don't know how many people are like, I don't need to. I've seen them online. And I'm like, well, wait, no. I'm like, like, I can see lots of things online. Like, but that doesn't mean that it's a reflection of the world around me, like directly around me. So do I need to allow myself to be so stressed out because it's not quite that reflection? And I think people are missing that particular point. They're not like, oh, you know what? Yeah, I saw 20 videos, but it turns out I don't know anybody that acts like this, nor does anybody that I know anybody that acts like this. So therefore, I can probably say that these people are far, far away from me, and they don't deserve the level of attention, negative or whatever, that I'm trying to give it. And I think this goes for the Mises Caucus, especially because I went around and like years ago, like 2021, 2020, yeah, 2020, 21, a little bit of 2022. And when I was going around like to different events and stuff like that, I specifically went and, inserted myself right in the middle of like the Mises table or the Mises tent or whatever. And I would just talk to people. And I found an entirely different perception of them than what you would see online. And so I was trying to tell people, I'm like, well, I don't know. I'm like, there are some bad eggs for sure. But one, I'm not even always sure that they're a Mises member. But the people that I know are a Mises member, because I literally was eyeball to eyeball with them effectively, and I was like shaking their hand. Like, I know they're members. They're there at the events. They're saying I am a Mises member in my face, and I had pretty pleasant conversations with them. And so I was like, maybe that's the key. Maybe the key is to temper what we see online by making sure that it actually reflects what's happening in the real world. Because online, there's a lot of there's a lot of things that happen that it's people do things online that they wouldn't do in real life. People, there are false flags. Some people, I've seen people act like they're somebody that they're not to make that somebody that they're not look bad. So like there's a lot of craziness online, and that's easily misconstrued as being too big. So anyway, that's my thoughts on the Mises Caucus, and then like why people hate them. But otherwise, I wouldn't really know because I don't have such a great relationship with too many of them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I always wonder. I think there are different motivations, but it's really hard to say what's going on here. It's rather strange, though. I I have to admit, I've been when I've had the candidates on here, I haven't really tested them that hard. I've been pretty easy on them, but I don't know.
And now I'm not
It
shaming
seems like
anybody for
yeah,
being easier.
yeah. It just seems like they're going to get enough negativity anyway. They don't need more from me, and since I
Oh, I don't
started
mean
the
be
show, yeah.
negative. I'm not
Oh
talking
yeah,
about being
sorry about
hostile or
that. Yeah,
negative. Just ask tough questions.
yeah,
So.
yeah. I know what you mean. Asking tough questions. It's I think one thing that's interesting is I don't. I think if you there seems to be a lack of there's a lack of nuance in the world now. Uh, did you ever watch that TV show, The Fugitive?
I don't think so. I don't think I've seen a single episode.
It was based on the guy was convicted of murder, but he was innocent. He's
Okay.
on the run. He's on the run and on the run trying to find the guy who actually did it.
Mm-hmm.
So as you can imagine, the final episode ends with with them finding and he gets released and he's now innocent.
Right.
And there's a scene at the very end where he looks at the cop who had been chasing him the whole time, and there's this, you can see though that there's this moment where they're both acknowledging each other's humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And the cop realizes he was a good guy who just wanted to, who wasn't guilty, and he probably felt bad for having to going after him.
Right.
And Richard Kimball, the man who was accused of murdering him, just realizes he was just doing what he thought he had to do, and you could see that there was this understanding and maybe even kind of a respect that they developed for each other.
Mm-hmm.
And nowadays, I don't know what happens anymore. It's just so crazy the way our society is now. And I don't know how we'll ever get it back. And I think there's a lot of people who don't really want us to get it back. I think they want it to be divided. They want to destroy civilization.
Right.
Yeah. It's yeah. Well, this has been a good talk. Anything else you want to say before we go?
No, I think we covered quite a bit of
Yeah,
ground.
we did. Yeah, it was interesting. Yeah.
You could find me Liberty Dad Pod on Twitter. I don't know if
yeah,
if you're into that kind of thing.
Is that your logo on the screen there?
Yeah, that's my little logo. I like to put it up there.
That's cool. Yeah, it's cool. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. I'm Chris Baker. Please like, follow, subscribe. Please go to my Substack and buy my novel Escape from the Village, and we are out. Yes, thank you.
Awesome.